Is it on?
It's on, yeah.
Good afternoon or early evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm the director of the Institute, and we have a fascinating occasion because we have both the governor of the Institute and my predecessor director speaking this afternoon. And to discuss one of the few reports done for government with a cartoon on the front. That's not the reason we're here. The cartoon was discussed at length. Michael and I spoke about it at the time, and did it convey the right imagery? And typically there's a very lively title, No Stone Unturned. From the author of the famous memo, It Took a Riot, going back 31 years. We know there will always be a sharp message. What we're here to discuss today is Michael Heseltine's report, which was produced a few weeks ago, and the government has promised a response a week on Wednesday in the autumn statement. And the report, to describe it as wide-ranging, is to almost underestimate its breadth and depth. There are 89 closely argued recommendations, all of which fit closely together on how to stimulate UK growth. Success, Lord Heseltine says, would require Whitehall to devolve more power. A theme which will appeal to the discussant, my predecessor Andrew Adonis, and one of my challenges this afternoon is to prevent them agreeing on certain subjects. So I'm going to limit the references to elected mayors. I'll ring a bell at this point. Andrew has ended his sabbatical from politics and is now actually part of the Labour team. He's also doing a review of how the machinery of government can better support business and looking at industrial policy. He's been working in the northeast particularly on this, but as anyone who follows his Twitter, Andrew never stays still, so any continuing railway complaints are noted on his Twitter. What we're going to have this evening is Lord Heseltine is going to speak to explain the main themes of his report. Andrew's going to reply. I'm going to moderate, perhaps a fond aspiration, their discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions. And the event will last until about 6:30, depending on how the discussion goes. Michael.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. The cartoon on the front, actually, I owe tribute to Lord Brown, because he said to me, you've got to realise that my desk is besieged day after day by reports, and they all look the same and broadly are the same. Yours has got to be different. So we tried to make it different, and hence the rather sort of ostentatious approach that we adopted. But Peter, you're right, it is quite extensive in its coverage, but if one can try to come down to one or two generalizations. The first generalization is that I think of all the broadly equivalent economies to ours in the world, we are the one that is out of step in the way in which it actually organizes itself. This country is over-centralized compared with any of which I have any knowledge. And it is not only over-centralized, but when it has become centralized, it has become functionally centralized. And basically, we have got a government machine in Whitehall that is a series of functional monopolies. I know of no economy which operates in that way. The reasons for it are self-evident, that this country in its great economic days was driven by Britain's provincial cities, and they were run by a lot of very tough entrepreneurial people who not only created a great deal of wealth, but created a great deal of socially unacceptable conditions. Democracy couldn't tolerate that, quite rightly, and so a process began of underpinning the economic performance with social provision. But of course, the disparate wealth in those communities meant that they couldn't afford the standard level of service, and so there had to be a massive redistribution of money. The money was taken in many cases from the great urban centres and recycled. Quite a few of those urban centres could actually have afforded the social welfare themselves, but many couldn't. So in the recycling process, Whitehall became much more important and organised the way in which the social underpinning took place. But of course, the consequence of that reorganisation is that the buccaneers, the wealth drivers, creators, were replaced by councillors administering social provision. And the cycle had the effect of leading to these functional monopolies. And they really were monopolies, where once central government departments became involved, they laid down in ever-increasing precision what they wanted to do with the money that they were redistributing. And we all know about it, circulars, ring-fence grants, whatever. It was very prescriptive, very centralized. The consequence of all of this is that instead of getting place-based policies, which every equivalent economy did, what does Manchester need? What are the strengths of Manchester? What should we do for Manchester? You got teams of officials working out what housing policy should be across the country. And another team doing transport, another team doing environment, someone else doing agriculture. And so the dynamic went over a very long period of time. Central government became increasingly disenchanted with local government or the agencies of local government. Local government is no good. Local government is not up to it. Local government delivers quite inadequate standards. Solution, quangos. This is not a party political point. I always quote the case of Keith Joseph, who you normally would have expected to be very much opposed to monopoly and centralism, created the Housing Corporation. But you can go on. There are many of them. And in the private sector, whereas practically every economy created agencies of the private sector to administer private sector activities, support private sector companies, we didn't. The easy way to think of it is the chambers of commerce. If you look at every other economy, they have powerful private sector activities. In America, it's slightly more confused. They have the Small Business Administration, but it has the effect of being a very dramatic agency working with the private sector. On the continent, they have public law status, which gives you a very powerful driver called the Chambers of Commerce. But broadly, they've all got organizations of this sort. In this country, the Chambers of Commerce represent a tiny proportion of the private sector, and no one in Whitehall ranks their performance. Sorry to use the words bluntly. That's not to say that Whitehall is right. There are some rather good chambers of commerce, but they are not ranked as quality. And so what you then get is a process where the decision-making is ever more concentrated. And another problem then emerges. Who checks the decision-makers? Where is the creative tension in Whitehall checking that this centralism, which has gone on for as long as it has, is actually delivering effective results, comparable results? So let's now go back to Whitehall. No one knows what happens in Whitehall. There is no way in which, as a minister, you can take over a government responsibility as Secretary of State and find out what your department is doing. If you become permanent secretary, there is no way you are presented with the information as to what your department is doing. Now, it's perfectly true that if you get to be the departmental head of a particular section, probably quite quickly you can find out what the people there are doing because they're there in the room with you or they talk to you all the time. But is there anybody actually with available the sort of information which is bread and butter to the private sector, which enables analysis to take place based upon comparative performance, based upon the measurement of outputs, based upon really who said you should do this in the first place, when did they say it, what did they ask you to do, what is the measurement of your performance, and are you living up to it? There is no sort of information of this sort. Second point is that even if there were There is nothing in Whitehall that actually conducts such a cross-examination. Now, in the private sector, you have the marketplace. You discover quite quickly whether you are in some way or other competitive or not. But in the monopolistic functionalism of Whitehall, there is no central criticism of what is going on, or measurement of what is going on. And so two of my recommendations. First is that there should be a management information system which does provide this information across departments, common form, not each one doing their own little thing so they can make it slightly different and therefore not comparable. And secondly, that there should be a team within Whitehall whose job it is to drive growth. Why growth? Well, growth, we all ought to be able to agree, is the prerequisite of raising standards or achieving more ambitious targets. We ought to be able to agree that the first thing we need is growth. We can have a great battle about what you do with the growth, but let's get the growth in the first place. So is there what I call a growth strategy in Whitehall? Now, the government would say there is, and with justice, because they have got papers saying that if you do this, that, and the other, you will get growth. That is, to them, a growth strategy, and I accept the definition and the good intentions behind it. But it's not what I call a growth strategy. What I call a growth strategy is that where every department has to explain what it is doing to attract growth, encourage growth, where it is appropriate that they should do it. Self-evidently, I'm not in beginning to say that if you have a Department of Health, the objective of the department should suddenly change from caring about people's health and finding solutions of that sort to actually driving the economy. That would be preposterous. But virtually every department has an element of it where growth potential exists. If I were to go stick with the Department of Health, they have obviously got the most sophisticated client group of patients you could look for. One of the major aspects of that client group of patients is that they're getting older. And as a consequence of getting older, they live longer and they have more problems associated with the elderly. And as a consequence of that, more and more of them get to the point where they need care, where they have to give up their own independence, where they have to move into sheltered accommodation or local authority accommodation, or whatever it may be, private nursing homes. So working with the medical equipment industry in order to find ever more sophisticated techniques, whether they be electronic monitoring, whether they be physical aids, or whatever it is self-evidently helpful to the patient cohort and helpful to the growth of the British economy. So expecting the Department of Health to work with the medical equipment industry would be part of an agenda for growth. I could give you 1,000 examples. I will give you one more example, which I'm always quite attracted by. I happen to think we have one of the best civil services in the world, and it has many characteristics. It's very able, but it's, broadly speak, corruption-free. And that is not universally the case with civil services across the world, but it is here. So, should we train civil servants? Well, I believe we should. How should we train civil servants? We should train them for many reasons, but we should train them with the capacity to administer effectively and accountably. Should we do it exclusively with simply civil servants? No, we shouldn't, because a huge part of civil service life is interacting with the private sector. So multidisciplinary approach seems to me self-evident. So you train them with the private sector. But why, at the moment, the outfit that does it is tucked away in the Ministry of Defence somewhere. Why don't we train the world's civil servants? Why don't we actually have schools for civil servants, multidisciplinary in the public and private sector? And why don't we offer training facilities to those countries which are emerging as sophisticated countries and haven't got the incredible experience we've got It would be good for prestige, it would be good for the long-term legacy, it would be good for the balance of payments. So why don't we do it? There are endless examples. So the growth strategy, central government setting out what it is, each government department saying this is the part we can play in the growth strategy and this is how we're doing it, a monitoring process to say you said you were going to do this last week and actually nothing has happened, we want to know why, is to me the ABC of good management practice in the private sector, and I see no reason at all why it shouldn't apply in the public sector, and particularly in central government. There are 89 recommendations. I've covered about 5 of them.
Plenty of time for the other 84, Michael. Thank you very much indeed on that. Now, Andrew, anything you disagree with there? Because you and Michael have in the past agreed on lots of things.
I think probably my disagreements were with some of the other 84. Can I begin by saying I've always been a great admirer of Michael Heseltine's. In fact, a year ago I went as far as to describe him in the New Statesman as my favourite Tory. I don't know if he was altogether flattered by the company I put him in. I said I was also a great admirer of Ken Livingstone's and Roy Jenkins because all three of them exemplify a characteristic which is unusual amongst executive politicians, which is the capacity to get anything much done. Roy Jenkins, in 21 months as Home Secretary, transformed the social face of the country, and Ken Livingstone transformed London in his 8 years as Mayor, and Michael, who shares a similar passion actually with Ken, that they wouldn't, I think, probably want to overdo their agreements on infrastructure. Almost all the things that Ken did, tall buildings, Crossrail, the congestion charge, or if I may put it this way, HESA policies. I'm not sure that Michael is quite so keen on buses as Ken is. I don't somehow imagine Michael in a bus. But nonetheless, there are a lot of shared characteristics there, which, as I say, are very unusual. And those of us in politics who have placed doing something over being someone have looked with admiration at Michael's own record. However, Michael is a role model, has been a role model of mine for a second reason, in that he understands, as very few politicians on the centre-right do in England, that an active market economy requires both responsible capitalism and an active state, and all three of those need to go hand in hand. And he also understands, as very few on the centre-left do, that those who support a strong state need to be the prime modernisers of the state and need to fight like mad against the vested interests, which are particularly entrenched on the left, which oppose the modernisation of the state. And a prime aspect of modernising the state is how an active state can learn from and work in close partnership with a successful private sector, and these need to go together. Most of what Michael proposes in his report comes under 4 headings: an active state, a modernised state, close dynamic partnership between private sector and the state, and responsible capitalism. And of the 89 recommendations, in fact, as I go through them, there are very few that I disagree with. And the only ones that cause me any real difficulty, which it might be worth exploring more in discussion, are how far the very weakness of the current devolved institutions makes it possible to devolve very substantial budgets to them. So, for example, the local economic partnerships, which Michael and I have both worked with in different ways. These are very, very weak institutions in terms of their credibility and in terms of their capacity to act. And how far they can, in fact, for example, take on all of the devolved skills budgets that Michael would like to give them is a big issue. But of course, you have to start somewhere. What I want to do, though, just very briefly, is to take 1 or 2 examples from each of the 4 headings that I've just given: an active state, a modernised state, close dynamic partnership between the private sector and the state, and responsible capitalism, and just make a few comments, mainly to show how far we've still got to go to achieve these objectives. Firstly, close dynamic partnership between private sector and the state. Michael referred in his remarks just now to the capacity of our civil service to train other civil services. I'd be much more content for it to do that if it was capable of training itself at all well, and if in particular it was capable of working in close partnership with the private sector, which ought to be a hallmark of a modern and effective civil service. In his report, Michael lauds secondments between the civil service and the private sector and vice versa. I'm strongly in support of those. I think unless you have mutual learning and exchanges of practice, it's very difficult to get close partnership working. And indeed, I understand that Bob Kerslake, the head of the Home Civil Service, said here at the Institute recently he was strongly in favour of secondments, and he wished to see them expanded. Well, let me let you into a secret. I've just put down some parliamentary questions on what's actually happening in terms of secondments between civil servants and the private sector, senior civil servants. We're talking about the people who Michael wants to see train the civil services of the world, and the private sector. To ask the Treasury how many civil servants are currently on secondment from the Treasury to companies in the United Kingdom, and the names of those companies. Reply: Her Majesty's Treasury does not currently have any senior civil servants on secondment to companies in the United Kingdom. That only happens to be the nerve centre of the British government. To ask the Department of Business and Innovation and Skills, which is the one which is supposed to be taking forward this active industrial policy, how many senior civil servants are on secondment to companies in the United Kingdom, and what were the names of those companies? In 2011, comes the reply, one senior civil servant was seconded out of the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. That's one seconded apparently to Tesco's. Now, there's great improvement taking place. In 2012, that number has risen to 3. We now have one on secondment to the BBC, which of course is a great example of the private sector. FTI Consulting, I don't know what FTI Consulting is, but I assume they're benefiting greatly, and Pearson. So we have one clear private sector company. Now, the Foreign Office is supposed to be in the business of promoting British trade abroad and being a key arm of Michael's active state bringing jobs to this country. So I asked the Foreign Office what they're doing in terms of secondments. Reply: There is currently one member of staff from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, senior management structure, on formal outward secondment, but things are getting better. The FCO, it says, also encourages new heads of mission to engage with business ahead of their departure to post as part of the effort to implement the FCO's Charter for Business. This is very good news, but this is what it involves. The scheme permits short-term attachments no longer than 1 week to companies and other organisations, and is designed to help senior FCO staff strengthen their general awareness and understanding of business issues relevant to their country of posting. All I can say is if 1 week is going to be enough to do that, that doesn't say much about how little there was before. However, just in case you think even that is a great step forward, there have been 16 such short-term placements since the scheme started a year ago. Now, I could go through the lot, as you will be reading in the FT soon as I write all this up. But the DCMS, which of course has great interactions with the private sector, there are currently 3 senior civil servants on secondment from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to organisations in the UK. The bodies concerned are the Gambling Commission, the Football Licensing Authority and the Leveson Inquiry. Well, I'm not quite sure what the Gambling Commission is gaining from the presence of Her Majesty's senior civil servants, but the Leveson Inquiry, I assume this means the government's writing its own report as we speak, and it's going to be published later on this week. My own department, the Department of Transport, I always include the Department of Transport because it shows what a useless job I did when I was Secretary of State. The department currently has 5 senior civil servants on secondment to organisations in the United Kingdom. I breathed a great sigh of relief there because that's the largest number I've identified in any department so far. However, it turns out that 4 are on secondment to HS2 Limited, and I'm strongly in favour of HS2 Limited. This is the organisation drawing up the plans for the high-speed rail, but it is in fact a part of the government. It's like seconding somebody from one end of the corridor to the other end of the corridor. And one was seconded to a local authority, but I could go on. And for that you can read many other aspects of training, I mean, the Civil Service has closed its training college. It has no proper training facility at all at the moment. I mean, you could go on. The weakness of the state in this regard is very great indeed. Secondly, responsible capitalism. Michael recommends, and I quote, governments should do far more to engage with potential foreign investors in core sectors to secure commitments to developing the UK research skills and supply base. Now, I very, very strongly endorse that recommendation. It is too often interpreted as interfering with procurement processes or picking winners. In my own experience, it's nothing of the kind. It's ministers and the government doing their job in terms of procurement to see that we get the maximum possible dividend for UK PLC. And I want to give you an example of how big a modernisation of the state this involves. When, as Transport Secretary, I was responsible for placing a huge order, many billions of pounds, for the successor trains to the Intercity 125s, trains which are now 35 years old and entirely clapped out. And indeed, because of the weakness of the infrastructure, they're not running anywhere at the moment because whenever we get any rain, the Great Western Main Line is closed across much of its reach. We were faced with the usual contracts coming in, which, because we only have one domestic rail manufacturer, in this case, but a Japanese company on top and then a German company second. And the only advice that you get is by lawyers in this great government machine. There was no industrial policy advice or advice on how you can maximise the benefits of UK PLC. And the advice from the lawyers, of course, is the EU procurement law means you can't do anything whatever to interfere with the bids that have come in and all that. Our concern was very simple. I love Japanese trains. The Japanese are the best train manufacturers in the world. They're now on their 7th generation of high-speed trains. They opened their first line in 1964. Just as we now have a wonderful Japanese car manufacturing sector, which started coming in Michael's time in government in the 1980s, we should be doing the same with rail manufacturing too. By a big process of interaction at very senior levels, it was possible to persuade the Japanese company, Hitachi, that they should, in return for getting the order to build all these trains, they should also build a factory which is currently being constructed in Newton Aycliffe in the northeast of England. Actually, we didn't care where they built it. It was up to them where they chose to build it, which would manufacture the trains and also do some next generation R&D and use it as a base for exporting to the rest of Europe. You would have thought this was a no-brainer and should be done in the case of all contracts of this kind. It wasn't. It was a massively difficult and fraught internal process, with the lawyers at every stage advising it shouldn't be done because it would be interfering with procurement rules, even though in fact the Japanese company in question was more than willing to do it because they did see this as a foothold in the European market. And so great and extensive is the capacity of British government to learn that less than a year later, when the next contract came along, which was for the Thameslink trains, a huge order for trains, which are going to run on the new modernised Thameslink line through the north, connecting the north and south of London. When that contract came forward in almost identical conditions, again, another overseas company, in this case Siemens, which was going to be awarded the contract. What did the government do to ensure domestic manufacture of the trains and the building of what could be a huge sector for a massively expanding market in Europe over the next 15 years? Absolutely nothing whatsoever. All of these trains are going to be made down in the southern part of Germany, and there'll be no boost to the UK manufacturing base at all. If we're going to follow Michael's advice, then that shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't happen in future. Thirdly, an active state. Michael says, and I quote, government should ensure the availability of long-term patient loan capital to growing businesses which do not want to dilute their equity. It should give serious consideration to tasking a new business bank to provide this either by itself or in partnership with the Business Growth Fund. I very strongly endorse that recommendation. From my own work on industrial policy, this is the norm in every other advanced country in the world that has some equivalent of a state investment bank like KfW in Germany, and we just need to get on and do it. And then fourthly, modernising the state. Michael makes great play in his report about the importance of decentralisation. My own reflection on this, reflecting on the fact that it was possible to abolish the regional development agencies, which Michael doesn't quite put it like that, but I take him to be opposed to that decision. I certainly am, on the basis of my experience in the northeast, where I think it's done terrible damage to local economic development. The fact that it was possible for a government to abolish the regional development agencies over a weekend, which is what happened, with no process of local consultation whatsoever, exactly the kind of proceeding I take Michael to say he wants to end by strengthening local democracy, brings me very strongly to the view that if you're going to have institutions that work at a local level, they have got to have democratic credibility. They cannot be quangos or set up by central government and operate at the behest of central government. They must have a base in elected legitimacy. It's why I spent a good part of last year with Michael going up and down the country campaigning, it has to be said very unsuccessfully, we weren't a very successful duo in this respect, for elected mayors for the major cities. The big problem which we had with the elected mayors, which we could discuss further over questions too, is that nobody could understand what they were going to do because the government wasn't proposing to give them more power. So it was very hard to make the case for them in the major cities. However, if it was possible, as recommended in the report, to set up metro mayors, that is mayors akin to the Mayor of London who cover the metropolitan regions around the cities, and to give them pretty well the same powers which the Mayor of London has in respect of regional transport, regional policing. I'm not a supporter of the idea of elected heads of single public services as we have with the police commissioners, and regional economic development. So these are all to do with devolving powers downwards, and probably also the skills budgets that Michael refers to too. Then there's a very good reason for voting for them, and they would have real legitimacy, and the next Labour government wouldn't then be capable of abolishing these over a weekend when it comes in and wants to undo the work of its predecessor. One final thought, reflecting on the report. The the first few pages of the report, I mean, the report itself is excellently written because it's all very much in Michael's own voice. But the first few pages of the report, which are Michael's own story, are fascinating. He writes as follows: "Before leaving Haymarket, I was still involved in the minutiae of everything that happened in the business, even approving every petty cash voucher over 50p. By contrast, on my first day in government, I was asked to read a few pages and sign off the 6 million electrification of a rail line in the east of England. 6 million, now we're proposing to spend 33 billion on building a high-speed line, but I let that one pass. I asked to see the managers responsible. Minister, I was told, if you start doing that, you will be left no time for your official work." It was clear from the start that government ministers were meant to approve papers and make decisions, not involve themselves in the hard grind of turning those policies into reality. Well, that brings to mind an experience of mine in a very similar condition when I arrived at the Department of Transport, where after a month or two I said I wanted to go round the country on the train to see it all for myself without any officials. And one of my senior officials said to me, "But Minister, you'll be harangued by angry passengers who will tell you how bad the service is." And I said, "That's fine," I said. "If they harangue me about how bad the service is, I can then harangue you, and then just possibly something might be done about it."
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. On that, you are. I remember your rural ride. It was one Easter, wasn't it? Round the UK. Even getting to parts which Michael Portillo has never got to on his train ride. Now, one thing which links you two, neither of you worked in the Treasury. And listening to you both talk about the changes needed and the approaches needed, the question comes, is the Treasury going to back you, Michael?
Well, we have to tolerate the tension for another 7 days, because they're going to tell us on Wednesday of next week. 9 days. And the Chancellor, his own language, we hope to implement a huge proportion of the report. But of course you could implement 80 of the 89 and not devolve any power at all if you left out the 9 crucial recommendations. But I think that if this recession has done one good thing, it has made a lot of people who've been absolutely sure about the simplistic solutions, devaluation, tax cuts, deregulation, sack every civil servant in sight, they've suddenly found that having done most of those things, actually not much has happened. And I think that there is now an interest in some of these rather more boring, detailed, managerial concepts, which every other country has adopted. But they, of course, you mustn't get carried away. Most other countries have got similar problems to us. So there's no magic in any of this. I do believe the one thing where there is magic is the gearing of competitive bidding for public funds. I mean, in my report, I analysed there is 49 billion pounds of taxpayers' money in the existing post-cut profile of public expenditure, plus 11 billion of European money, which is a total of 60 billion, which is functionally allocated. You want a road, it costs £1, you get £1, you get a road. What my proposal does is to say, we've got 60 billion, you tell us what you would do if you get any part of that 60 billion. And my experience, London Docklands, City Challenge, Regional Growth Fund, is that you can find gearing of anything up to 4, 5, 6 to 1. Once the localities, the drivers, actually say, my God, if we could do it the way we want it, if we could use the money we think, then we could add this, that, and the other, or we could attract this, that, or the other. Sovereign wealth fund, realization of their own assets, whatever it is. And so that is the big economic driver, that if they've got 60 billion, if it worked, they could find themselves with significant elevation of that figure. Now, I've never given a figure because that will immediately give the national press the opportunity to say you didn't hit the figure, it's a failure, which is what they'll do. So we got 60 billion, you get 60 billion plus 1, it's a success.
Can I take up the point with you, Andrew? I mean, of the centre, how much of the changes which both you and Michael in overlapping ways want depends on a change in the central government to make it work, particularly with the Treasury?
I'm not sure it's just the Treasury, actually. The Treasury just reflects in an extreme form the views of Whitehall as a whole, which is very, very poor knowledge of England outside London. The further north you go, the less the knowledge is. Very poor training. I mean, I was shocked in all of the ministerial posts I held at how little civil servants knew about the services they were supposed to be administering, how few civil servants in the Ministry, in the Department for Education, had actually any experience of schools besides having attended one many moons ago, unless their children were at one, and they very few of them, for example, were school governors. I remember having a wonderful discussion with my permanent secretary about whether or not we could recruit into the Department for Education people who'd been on the Teach First scheme, which is the most outstanding training of young graduates who go for 2 years into schools, of course, great experience of education as a result. And these ought to be exactly the kind of people who, after all, have exhibited a lot of enthusiasm for education, only committed to 2 years, coming in as fast streamers, and was told that the civil service commissioners wouldn't allow this to be regarded as a criteria or for entry, because it would make the competition for the fast stream unfair. And it took a personal intervention by the Prime Minister with the head of the Home Civil Service even to allow people to mark on the form that they had been an attendee, been on the Teach First scheme, and for that to be taken into account when they applied. So in fact, you know, I could go through it case by case. I only had one person in the Department for Education, so Department for Transport, working with me on rail bidding, who'd actually run a train company. Now, I was sitting there with the government's chequebook, billions of pounds, clinging for dear life to my one person who actually understood what it was like to be on the other side of the table. That one person retired soon after I left, and when you look at what's happened in the West Coast, need I say more? You know, there is a real problem in terms of just lack of knowledge of the country and of services outside London. That is not a criticism of the calibre or the public service commitment of civil servants, which in my experience is exemplary, as Michael said. It's a deep, deep criticism, though, of their training and of the ways in which they're recruited, and the interchange between the civil service and the services and the private sector that they're expected to engage with.
Michael.
Just let me add to what Andrew's just said. The last figures the government published showed there were 571 schools in this country who are producing children, 20% of whom are, by modern standards, illiterate or enumerate. When I said 571, there's 571 SINC schools. Now, not all the kids that are in the category I've said come out of those schools, but just have those two figures in mind. 571 totally inadequate schools, 20% of the product of our education system today, by modern standards, are enumerate and what's the other word? Illiterate. Now that's today. Don't think this is a party political point that I'm criticising this government. That is, if anything, probably the best it has been. It is, looking back, it has always been like that. Now, those 20%, broadly speaking, are not going to find jobs. If you can't read and understand the prescription on a pill box, no one's going to let you be a carer looking after old people. If you can't read the poison label on a weed killer, nobody is going to let you near a garden. So the product of that sort of education system means that you and I are going to pay for them to do nothing, and on and on and on. Now, in the sort of society that I think we ought to be part of, there would have been a revolution. Civil servants, ministers, the press would have, just gone mad with indignation. You and I are all paying for that phenomenon, accumulated over decades.
Could I...
I should add, there was a book published a few months ago under the title Education, Education, Education. I had one or two things to say about that, but I'm far too modest to say who was the author.
It's an excellent book, which also reflects something else I just wanted to come on to, which is you were both very activist ministers. You believed in driving, in parallel ways, change. I come back to this theme of how much Whitehall has to change. I mean, you at the Department of Environment, Ministry of Defence, and then back at Environment again, had a particular view of what a minister did. You, Andrew, both at Education and at Transport, equally believed the minister had to be the kind of entrepreneur who drove change. How much can that be? I mean, you were both rather unusual in that respect, as our own researches on effective ministers show. How much, therefore, does the structure have to change to achieve the objectives you're describing? Andrew?
I don't think the structure needs to change at all. I just think you need activist ministers.
And,
And there aren't very many of them.
I think, Andrew, I think we ought to just discuss that in order to preserve our unity. I do think it has to change in two material ways. One is the management information, but the second is the creative tension. I mean, there is a creative tension in Whitehall, and it's a financial discipline. The Treasury have one very clear objective in life, and that is to control the money. But as long as they can control the money in total, that's their job. What they don't do, and what no one else does, is to pursue value for money in the sort of remorseless detail that this sort of thing requires. And I think the only way to do that, there are two things that I think are essential. One is that the Prime Minister must make it a personal commitment, because that's where power lies in Whitehall, and it's the only place where real power lies. And secondly, there has to be a machine answerable to the Prime Minister, and in my view, an economic committee of the Cabinet, which spends its life driving these comparative performance activities. Now, curiously enough, a very interesting thing is happening, and this is what made me think quite a bit about whether my views were out of date. The Treasury, either by determination or by just coincidence, is changing. And they have accumulated in the Treasury today a major infrastructure capability for big projects. They never had that before. They are the sponsor of the financial services industry. They may have had that for some time, but I had quite a bit of it when I was doing DTI. They had some even then. They have got Greg Clark and the city's agenda, and they have now recruited the guy who made such a success of LOCOG. And you're involved with that. So they have got a top-class administrator. They have got at least 3 major functional responsibilities outside the normal Trinity discipline. And my own view in the report said that of the many ways of achieving what I want, one of the ways is to simply recognize you've already created it and make it comprehensive across Whitehall.
Okay.
I don't disagree with any of that. I would point out, though, that the salary cap is proving quite a big obstacle to bringing people in at the moment. And when I look back at my former department, a part of the problem about bringing people with really serious private sector experience in, that has been a major obstacle. And I think it's quite important to understand that if you're going to have people with really serious commercial experience at the heart of government, which you absolutely need if the government is going to be a good procurer of services and a good manager of contracts, then you've got to be prepared to, I mean, we're not talking about paying the going rate, we're talking about simply being able to pay sufficient to attract them.
Well, let's just talk about this, because this is another one which we did, a stone we did turn over. £274 billion a year of public sector contracts are let by the government. I'll just repeat the figure so we get it in our minds. £274 billion a year. Government's latest figures, 60% of those contracts will run over time and over budget. Well, don't ask me what the cost-saving potential is of getting them to run to time and to budget. You can get quite carried away with the sort of figures you'd come up with. But curious enough, that is not my total preoccupation. It's not even my first preoccupation. My first preoccupation is, what does it say about the British companies that are tendering for those £274 billion worth of contracts? if the whole psychology is, well, if we a bit over time, if we're a bit over cost, it'll all be all right on the night. What does that do for the competitiveness of British industrial capability when they go and try and get contracts like that in Germany? So that's an analysis, and we could all get terribly indignant about that. But now let's move on to the solution to the analysis, and this is why Andrew rightly raised the point. The sort of money that the people in Whitehall would earn to supervise these contracts is about 100,000 a year. Oh, it's quite a lot of money. I mean, let's not knock it. Quite a lot of money. The equivalent of the person in the private sector doing that job is 300,000 a year. Government had a solution, quite an interesting solution. We will take our 100,000 a year people and we will send them off to be trained to be effective. Problem. If it works and they come back, the private sector will employ them at 300,000 a year. The government won't let them be employed at 300,000 a year because the pay ceilings are frozen under this, that, or the other policy. And all governments have policies of this sort. This is not a criticism of this government. It all works somehow or other. It would have worked the same way. However, you've got the message that there is only one solution, and that is that you have got to, in the public sector, recruit off the marketplace for people of the skills that you need. And there is no way you can get them by retraining the civil service. It takes too long, and they won't stay at the rates that you'd then be paying. So you've got to take them off the marketplace, or accept the fact that you're going to have 60% of the contracts over time and over budget.
Can I, before opening up, which I want to say, take up a point which Andrew made on the localism aspect of your recommendations. That the implicit was that the structures are just too weak to take the extent of financial devolution, that the bureaucratic devolution is to local economic partnerships. Local economic partnerships are very patchy, very weak, and to give that degree of responsibility could well produce enormous problems, and that it's in a sense a leap too far.
Yes, Andrew's right. It's what Whitehall believes, and there's a great deal of substance in it. Solution, stay where we are. Wrong solution. The right solution is to say, yes, they're weak, they're not up to it, we've got to do something about it. We're going to make them strong. Let's all assume we were now the board of ICI. Well, not ICI, it's gone, bad example. Let's the board of Shell, check first name that comes off the top of my head, second name that comes off the top of my head. And we discover that our subsidiary in Newcastle-on-Tyne is not doing well. We're all a bit worried about Newcastle-on-Tyne, Shell Limited. And up comes a bright spark on the board and says, well, I tell you what we should do. We should move the administration of Shell Newcastle-on-Tyne to head office here in London. I doubt if he would survive the afternoon. They would sort out the problem of the board in Newcastle-on-Tyne. They would get people to run the board, to run it effectively, to manage it effectively. We do exactly the opposite. We say they aren't any good. We don't think they could possibly be any good. We will centralize the process. That is what we have done over 100 years. And look where it's got us, I say to myself. Now, there are two big examples of this in the private sector, the trade associations and the chambers of commerce. Step forward, Lord Devlin, 1972. Major government report, all there, set out quite clearly what needed to be done. What was done? You know it, nothing. Of course, it's right to say that at the moment, these organizations would not be capable of carrying out across the country the sort of scale of responsibility. So in my report, I provide suggestions as to how they get more money, how that gives them the resource, how they get the people, and I give them time because my devolution processes don't really bite until 2015 because this is capital expenditure, you can't change it that quickly. So I start off by saying, well, if I give you an example, I sat in Liverpool a fortnight ago listening to a presentation about skills and they wanted to create a UTC. And we had the mayor of Liverpool there, we had the vice-chancellor there, we had the bosses of about 3 private sector companies there, and we had the person running the local academy there, and a range of other people of that sort of caliber. And I got more and more furious as the presentation went on. It was so good, so impassioned, so relevant to the local economy, so full of examples of what could happen and what the benefits were. And every time one of them spoke, I saw an official in London saying, oh no, you know, don't think that would work really. I'm not sure we can trust them. I think, you know, the problems are. And I just knew that we've got to stop this business of a tiny number of officials, rightly described by Peter and Andrew earlier on, as not having never having run anything, having no real knowledge of the conditions in the places they're talking about, have hardly ever been to an inner city problem with the sort we have to deal with, saying it's all too difficult. Or the lawyers inventing a whole lot of spurious legal objections which don't turn out to be justified often, to say that these things can't be done in a competitive way.
Andrew, do you want to come back on that point? Because it's after you devoted a lot of passion and commitment to trying to revive local democracy and local leadership.
Well, I think you have this problem of democratic mandate. In the case of the LEPs, I'm doing a report on at the behest of Michael actually, I'm doing a report for the North Eastern LEP on the economic development of the North East. That LEP employs 5 people. It has 1 member of staff who is as a successive member of staff from the Regional Development Agency. They told me of the next door LEP, the other side of the Pennines, that doesn't have any staff whatsoever. It depends upon the local Chamber of Commerce seconding somebody to work, I think, a day a week for it. So we are talking about extremely weak institutions at the moment, which don't even, in many cases, even have buy-in from their local authorities. Michael is right, we have to start somewhere. That is since the abolition of the RDAs, those are the only regional economic development institutions that we've got, so we need to make the best of them. I'm simply making the point that they are very weak institutions, and I wonder myself whether you are better building on elected local governments and seeking in particular, as his report suggests, to give big incentives for the creation of city regional authorities, which would be elected, but on a streamlined mayoral type model, as in London, and giving big devolution of budgets to them. But how you get from here to there is extremely difficult. It would help if each new government didn't start by abolishing the institutions which its predecessor created in these localities. My one was to blame as well. We did the same when we created the RDAs. A whole load of institutions were abolished before. As I say, one of the first things that was done by the present government was to abolish the RDAs. Trying to get some continuity in the institutional fabric of localities is quite an important is quite an important objective, and I think therefore we've got to try and make the best that we can of these LEPs, but they are a very, very weak and shaky basis on which to build.
Now, I just want to open up to questions. I noticed Bernard Jenkins.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to Michael Heseltine coming in front of our select committee next week. I think we're the only select committee that's invited you to appear before them as a result of your report. Very interested.
There's been another one since.
Well, I've started the trend. But we're very interested in what you're going to say about strategic thinking, on which we've done a lot of work, about strategic thinking in government, about leadership in government, and we're embarking on an inquiry into civil service reform. And I would challenge you that there is a conundrum in what you're saying. Funnily enough, the government was very committed, the coalition was very committed to this localism and decentralisation agenda. And one of the things that we're dealing with is the extraordinary resistance that ministers believe they have encountered in this effort. And all the reflexes are in the opposite direction, and it seems very difficult to find anybody who feels that they're responsible for these reflexes, but they're there. But the conundrum at the heart of what you say, on one hand you want to hand a whole lot of things down the food chain, but in government itself you seem to endorse a centralisation, and in some respects departments are losing their coherence because they're less responsible for direct implementation, because of contracting out and agencies and so on. And they're less responsible for the formulation of policy, which is moved over to the Treasury and the Cabinet Office and the Downing Street Policy Unit. And I would say the permanent secretaries have less direct control over policy with their secretaries of state than ever, though I'm told by some that this has reversed somewhat since the coalition got in, because the Prime Minister is more strategic than his predecessor. What do you think about this? But we seem to have built in a sort of inherent dysfunctionality into the structure of the Westminster government itself, Whitehall itself.
Michael.
Well, I frankly don't distinguish between officials and ministers. I think that it's the oldest human saying of them all, what I have, I hold. And it requires no very sophisticated Sir Humphrey to persuade his minister that devolution is wonderful for everybody, but not you, minister. And they all work together broadly in the same lines. But I don't recognize my model as quite the way you described it. First of all, there has to be a government policy called growth, and it has to be articulated, and it should be set out clearly. I don't think any government would disagree with that view. The second point is that it can only be meaningful if it embraces every relevant department. So if the government says, let us have growth, the Department of DCLG has got to say, yes, we'll get the planning machine moving faster, for example, as part of the growth agenda. So that should be uncontroversial. But then you have to have, and this is why I thought you were suggesting I was being too centralist, you have to have someone in government who watches to see what the DCLG is doing and says, look, you've said you're going to speed it up, but actually, nothing's happened. What do you mean by that? And you can go on from every department. There's the same story, that the ministers can make a statement, the officials can administer the consequence of the statement, but unless something is monitoring it, it's too easy for nothing to happen. So you've got to have someone creatively in the center of government saying, look, I'm very sorry, but this policy isn't working, or it's not delivering what you said it would, or it's behind time. And that is the point that I'm on about. Now, you can say that is a check on ministerial power. Well, yes, it is. And that if you're talking about underperformance, we need a check on ministerial power. But it isn't a diminution of government, because the two of them are part of what any company would have, you know.
Yeah. I'll take two over there, then we'll move over this way. Or two here. Andrew Stone, then.
Hi, I'm Andrew Stone, and you used my name without my permission. But I used to be the managing director of Marks & Spencer's, and I entirely understand that you can have a central understanding that you have to have growth, but the buying departments have to be free to grow, and each individual store, which is, I think, what you're saying. And just as an example, I chair a very good charity where 10 other countries said, this is amazing that you're doing this. Can we make it international? And so we began to do that, and we think we're going to raise another £1 million by internationalising ourselves, taking some of our £50,000 of our own resource to do it. And I thought, that's amazing. I wonder whether other charities in this country are thinking of internationalising themselves. I couldn't help it because of my background. And so I looked it up, and we've got 262,000 charities and so many social enterprises. So I made a speech in the House of Lords about the suggestion, and it was good that both the British Council, who I suggested manage this, and Nick Hurd asked to see me. But when I said, look, out of 262,000, if we had some sort of hub that helped them to expand, we think we're going to raise £1 million in the first year of becoming international. So for 1,000 of those 62,000, there would be £1 billion more money coming in, and also we'd have 1,000 charities who were central to the UK. But what I got from talking to the people in government is they didn't understand that this was a growth thing. I was only doing it to suggest this is how you grow. And they got all sorts of bits about that, but didn't understand, my God, you know, you just do this and you can grow. So I very much understand what you're saying here, and it's something in the DNA that doesn't exist.
Yeah, can I take Alan House next? in front of you, and then I'll switch over here. And then I'll ask Michael to comment after that.
Alan Hart. On the frustrations, the difficulties of achieving meaningful localism, I want to ask Michael whether there's an additional factor that may have frustrated him. You were very effective in enabling remarkable things to be achieved at Dockland, Liverpool and elsewhere. But I think it would be not unfair to say that although you absolutely saw the need to do it, you were not successful in achieving the revitalisation of local government across the country that is so badly needed both for our economy and for our democracy. And is it because among all the functional monopolies in Whitehall, the Treasury is itself the most rapaciously monopolistic, the most jealous, the most relentlessly hostile to independent centres of power? And is it they who prevent this happening? And if I can ask a quick question about contracts, the £264 billion worth of the different subject, and the difficulties of getting the right kind of scrutiny of them as they're let. Why is Whitehall so secretive about the contracts? Departments hide behind the mantra of commercial confidence. But if the contracts that are to be let were more fully exposed to expert scrutiny, other public scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny, might we not get better quality contracts?
Right. You'd like to take on those 2 points?
Well, on the first point, which is about the internationalisation of, I mean, you have an expertise which I don't have on that subject of the charities. But on the Chambers of Commerce, I have been interested in this subject for many years. And in doing my report, what was most interesting is that Whitehall didn't have a knowledge of what chambers were doing overseas. So when the Prime Minister sets off for two of the BRICS, Brazil and India, and discovers when he gets there that there were no British chambers of commerce. I mean, you know, then you find out what the Germans have got. And it's absolutely amazing, the facility, the backing of the German chambers for their companies. Now, on Alan's point about the rapacious appetite of the Treasury, if I'd been doing this report a year ago, I would almost certainly have said that the Treasury's got a job to do. It's in the business of controlling expenditure, etc., which it does, well, it does as well as the political masters will let them. And that's what it does. I would never have said that they could become an engine for growth, because their simplistic views of growth are not the same as mine. I've always been interested in what other countries do, and what we tried to do, and I hesitate to say it, with the Department of Economic Affairs in the 60s. The fact is that everyone knows George Brown was intoxicated most of the time and the thing fell apart. But that doesn't mean to say that the idea was bad. It was never given a chance. Or you had Hal Macmillan and Neddy and the little Neddies. I was involved on a Neddy that was a farce. I mean, there was no interest at all in making it work. The three parties turned up with their prepared statements, and the whole point was to get through the meeting so they'd go outside and make the sort of abusive remarks they did about each other. So we never gave any of these things any sort of credibility. But, and I would not have thought the Treasury had it within them to change. But then, as I said to Andrew a few minutes ago, I suddenly discovered the Treasury has changed. And then I say to myself, and forgive me for putting it like this, they asked me, and the Prime Minister, and George Osborne, Vince Cable, asked me to do this report. Well, you know, I come with baggage. Everybody knows what I believe, and I've been saying it for 30 years, so there's no surprise in any of this report. And yet they asked me to do it. So in a sort of other naive way, and looking for a fall in 9 days' time, I think maybe something's stirring out there.
David Sainsbury. David, there's a mic coming for you.
Could I perhaps just come back, David Sainsbury, perhaps I could just come back to this question of the relationship between the centre of government and departments. Because when I was in government and since then, I've tried to push 3 of the proposals that are in your report. They are on procurement being used for innovation, the use of research funds, and the SBRI scheme for giving research grants to new products from departments. And then recently the whole question of proper management accounts for departments. In all three cases, the point has been made that the centre of government cannot tell department what to do. In fact, in the case of procurement, I was told that the only way it could be done if there was a compact between the centre of government and the departments, rather as if you were negotiating treaties with foreign countries. It seems to me unless the government tackles this issue and says, no, that the centre of government can lay down certain things which will be done by departments, the rest of it is a waste of time. That's one of the oldest problems, it seems to me, in our government. And until you change it, any talk of a growth strategy is really just going to be hampered because it will never be delivered.
Well, can I invite both to comment on that? Well, Andrew, why don't you comment first and Michael?
I agree. We have somebody called the head of the Home Civil Service who isn't in fact in charge of the civil service in any meaningful sense at all. So little does he regard the worth of the job that he does it part-time whilst being permanent secretary at another department which he spends most of his time at. So until we actually have a centre that resembles the centre of any other organisation in terms of reporting lines and authority, it's not going to change.
Michael?
Well, look, we're all agreeing, but I'm perhaps taking the next step and saying, does it need to be like this? And my view is, doesn't. I mean, let's imagine we are now the cabinet. The Prime Minister calls a meeting and he says, colleagues, we want to talk about growth. Do we all believe in growth? Well, who's going to say no? Do we all believe that we should all try to contribute to growth? Who's going to say no? Thank you very much, colleagues. My suggestion is that each of you prepares your growth strategy compatible with government policy, and shall we meet in a week's time to look at what you've got to say? To which, in a week's time, I can tell you would get some pretty mixed views, but you could then have a private conversation saying, look, Bill, you're a great figure in the party, but I don't think this is quite up to where we hoped it would be. And I've got a very nice friend here who would like to have, the non-executive director in your department, for example, would like to have a word with you about what we can do. I see you as having a very powerful future in this party, and I want to help you in every way I can, don't I? And by the way, colleagues, I think we must be sure we are world competitive, and therefore I've asked this new guy who's come in from Locock, who's been a demon on the Olympics, and everybody thinks he's an international triumph, to just keep in touch with what you're doing and tell you how you're getting on. And of course, he'll tell me as well, but I mean, don't be... Now, what conclusion does the Cabinet come to? It comes to the conclusion you've got a machine.
Yeah, but you can't do this if the only way you're going to do it is to have the Prime Ministers doing project management. I mean, this is, you have to have a civil service which has the authority, and the head of the civil service, to talk to permanent secretaries and make these things happen. Because all the experiences, the Prime Ministers are not good project managers, and in any case should not spend their time doing this.
No, but you see, the Cabinet meeting that I've just outlined is easily achievable. Each minister's put in charge of delivering a growth strategy, which has got to be submitted to the Cabinet Committee. And then you've got a team who pursue implementation. And I don't think you'd have any problems. Indeed, I tell you what I actually think would happen. I think that a lot of ministers would realize that they had not given as much thought to the growth in their department as actually the urgency of the situation demands. I mean, if you can be a brilliantly successful minister if you have a party political point, a manifesto, commitment, whatever it is, if you can go to the House of Commons and you can make speeches which are occasionally reported and quite funny, and you don't get yourself into any trouble. And then 2 years later, you get moved to some other department. And you can do it. Because no one ever said to you, we think you could actually contribute to national growth. I mean, we haven't discussed this, but by and large, the day you become a minister, it's like being sort of cocooned in a department. Tell us how you get on. There's no induction process. You know all about that.
Yeah, we recommend good induction.
Indeed.
Quite a few people are hands coming up, so I'm going to group two together. And we've now had glimpses of what might have been if you'd been Prime Minister. Andrew.
Andrew Kahn. I accept entirely what you say about the civil servants having failed to train themselves and act in the right way, but there is also a cultural problem in this country. And just as an example of it, I mean, you say, Andrew, about Bob Kerslake encouraging secondments. He was mainly focused actually on interchange and on getting people coming into work, into the civil service and going out. But the fact is, all of the pressure is on not having interchange. And the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee on Business Appointments effectively says to civil servants, don't even think of going out and doing anything useful in the private sector. More to the point, it says to anybody who's thinking of coming into the civil service, well, be careful about coming in because you won't be able to go out and resume your old career at all easily. You'll have constraints. In the same way, entrepreneurialism in the civil service really isn't encouraged. What is encouraged is not taking a risk and never failing. So the question is, how do we change the culture, not only within the civil service, but within Parliament, which makes a mockery of any civil servant who ever takes a risk and fails, within the media, which does the same thing, and within the general public. Because without that culture change, any changes you make in the civil service still won't take.
And Toby Perkins there, and then we'll group those two questions together.
Thank you. Toby Perkins from the Shadow Biz team. This week, a number of the Shadow Biz and Shadow Treasury teams are going over to Germany to learn about the savings banks models that they have there. Now, you mentioned previously the Labour Small Business Task Force was looking at the idea of a British investment bank. I'm interested in two aspects to that. The first is one of the lessons from Germany is that they have a very regionally focused savings bank. How do you see the model of investment bank that you're talking about working on a regional basis, because the needs in the northeast are totally different to the needs in the southwest, and I would suggest that there's a real need for regional understanding of that sort of model. And the second thing is, do you see a role for that in terms of investing within sectors that need specific expertise? Because one of the problems is that individual industry sectors require industry knowledge and specialism, and that's one of the things that's really lacking in our current banking model and potentially might be lacking in the investment bank model too.
Thank you, Toby. I mean, just two issues there. One Andrew Kahn raised on the culture, discouraging interchange, and then on the savings bank model and to make it both regionally and sectorally attractive to lending.
I think your point about the cultural problem of parliamentary accountability, indeed I say in my report that if the private sector was burdened with the sort of record keeping that the Parliament requires over every decision in case something goes wrong, then you would bring the private sector to its knees. It is extraordinary that you run a hugely sophisticated state. One thing goes wrong and the public sector is expected to have the most minute record all the way back to be sure that you can put your finger on who exactly did what when. Now the bureaucratic cost of doing that and the caution in the culture of being subject to that is rightly as you describe. And it's very difficult to know what meaningfully you can do. I mean, what I would love to see a Prime Minister do is to stand up in Prime Minister's question time and say, I'll ask the Secretary of State for Health to talk to you about that or answer questions tomorrow. The day that you have got a situation where a Prime Minister can be questioned about anything without notice, you are asking for the sort of culture. And I think I'm pretty sure we're unlike any other country. You'd probably know much as I do. But I can't think of another country which expects the Prime Minister to be the ultimate information source on whether the hospital in North Wales was fire inspected last week or the week before, you know. So if a Prime Minister was prepared to confront the Commons and say, no, I'm sorry, but these things are matters for a department or for a local authority, then you could perhaps begin to change the culture. You'd need a big majority and you'd need a 5-year parliament. But after about 6 months of being abused by the opposition, and I would be the first to abuse such a Prime Minister if I was there, let me say, because that's what you do in opposition, But after about 6 months, I think the process would people get used to it. That would be a step, but it's a big step.
What about on the savings bank question?
Well, the interesting thing that what I heard you say is, and it's exactly the point about my chambers of commerce, you're going off to Germany to have a look at these issues. I mean, these issues have been on the table since the 1950s, you know, and exactly what I found with the chambers of commerce. There's no, in Whitehall they don't know. You know, this is the most effective capitalist economy within a handful of miles of where we are, knocking the spots off us in export markets, and we don't know how they're doing it. I find that mind-blowing. And you know, again, it'd be so easy for someone to say, well, Heseltine knocks this, that, or the other minister, or whatever it is. This has gone on for decades. This complete sort of idea that we're out there winning, you know. We're not winning. And we ought to have in Whitehall, as a matter of culture, a competitiveness agenda in each sector where the matter is relevant, which says this is what every other country is doing. Best practice is this. This is what the results are. It ought to be A, B, and C to any minister to say, tell me, show me. But we don't.
Right, we've got time for a couple more questions, which I'll take at the back. One thing I'd just point out in Germany, one of our research projects showed the Germans had I think it was 16 or 17 economy ministers, equivalent of our trade and business ministers since 1945.
Yeah.
We'd had 35.
Yeah.
Not an obvious correlation of success. John Davis, then Alan Evans.
John Davis, Smiling Group. Lord Heseltine, I think this report is the most important one to come out of this Parliament. I was particularly interested to see that part of the reason you were asked was a meeting between you and Steve Hilton, who then put you in touch with the Prime Minister. Now, I contrast that with the Beecroft report, which was a very, very different beast, wasn't it? Very, very much on the free markets side. What I put to you a bit cheekily is that if this report is completely accepted in the autumn statement in 9 days' time, this really represents Plan B.
Alan?
Thank you. Alan Evans. Winston Churchill, during the Second World War, ran the country with a war cabinet of, I think, 6 or 7 people. When he became Prime Minister in 1951, he had a cabinet of 16. When you, Lord Heseltine, were in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, it had just over 20. And now, around the cabinet table, there are 32 people. I just wonder whether you think that that increase in numbers has been met by a commensurate increase in the ability of government to join up and tackle these issues of growth that you've outlined, or whether perhaps another way of putting it would be, have we got too many ministers?
Well, I think it's produced a wonderful opportunity to fragment even more the Whitehall that exists. We certainly haven't got joined-up government, that is true, and we haven't. I mean, but again, you know, this is not a party point. The Prime Minister's always believed this. Every Prime Minister I can think of offhand believed Whitehall didn't respond effectively to what Downing Street wanted. And they felt frustrated by it, but I never saw a Prime Minister deal with it by creating the machinery that would actually work. And in truth, I mean, I'm partially guilty of this, because I can remember Margaret Thatcher. She took Percy Craddock from the Foreign Office and moved him into number 10, and that was the first step. Well, that didn't worry me a great. Well, then you had Alan Walters, who was a Treasury guy, when that led to a bust-up with Nigel Lawson. But in my terms, the next person she took after Percy Craddock was a guy from the Ministry of Defence. And at that time, I had a perfectly good relationship with Margaret Thatcher. She'd promoted me, and I'd done the sort of thing she liked. So it was perfectly all right. But when I saw that happen, I said, hello, I know what this means. Ministers all the time have to make very difficult decisions, and they're usually a balance. You know, if there were 100-to-1 decisions, they wouldn't come near ministers. They would long since have been taken. It's when they get to sort of 45-55, and there's a lot of politics on both sides, ministers have to make a decision. And it's a pretty rudimentary process in the end. You've got to make up your mind. A lot of people get hurt and disappointed as a consequence of it. And perhaps sometimes you take a decision in the middle of the night because you're under pressure and all that sort of thing, and you haven't had 25 meetings in which you've consulted everybody in sight. So there's a lot of chatter going on in your department. Was he late for the meeting? Did he understand? Was he fast asleep? Had he had too much to drink? You can imagine all the stuff that goes on. Not in my case, of course, but that's a different matter. But you know the point I'm trying to make. And what I was concerned about is that the chatter in the department would just get fed back into number 10 and would become part of the process of, distancing and, you know, breaking up the team and all that sort of stuff. So I said, look, fine, you want someone from my department, that's perfectly fair, you're the Prime Minister. I said to my permanent secretary, this is what the Prime Minister wants, but would you be kind enough to insist that every time he had a meeting with number 10, my private secretary was present, so that I would know what the chat was. He was back in the department in a month.
What about Plan B? What about the Plan B?
Plan B, yeah, well, look, I did say that I think that this crisis, if it has an upside, has made people look into the sort of the minutiae of government performance, perhaps in a more open-minded way than has been characteristic of much of what's gone on over the last 50 years. And you can't escape the fact that if the Prime Minister and his principal colleagues say to someone like me, what do you think? They don't do it in a sort of vacuum in which they say, well, pluck him out of the air. They must have some idea that maybe I've been somewhere or done something that has got some relevance, might be of some help. But I don't call that Plan B. I think that is to use the sort of language of the press, always looking for some way of undermining and, you know, diverting and sensationalizing. I think that much more realistically, that in my particular experience, they've seen, for example, the way the Regional Growth Fund has delivered £6 of gearing for every one of public expenditure in the most outlying areas of the country. And they've said, well, if we could get more of that, that would be a good thing. So let's see if there's anything in these ideas based on Docklands and City Challenge and the Regional Growth Fund. Let's let him have a look. And he's always been manic about management in the public sector, so let him have a look at some of the management practices. What harm is there in that? I don't regard that as Plan B. I think that's a logical extension of where they are. Indeed, I would go further, and this is a deliberate part of the thinking behind the report. I believe I'm right in saying that of the 89 recommendations, there is not one that is not an extension of what this government has been doing. And I deliberately tried to do two things. First of all, I talked to the TUC and the Labour Party as openly as I talked to anybody else, because I wanted to try and stop this business of it becoming a party political divide. And I don't think Andrew will be embarrassed by saying this, but he's been helpful to me in talking to me about these things, as was Chucker, and as was the TUC. So I deliberately tried to depoliticize it. And if you look at the graphs and the charts, you'll find that the politics has been taken out of it. It's very difficult to spot unless you've really got a slide rule where one government came in and another one left, because I didn't want someone waving it around at a party conference saying, look at this, the way that I would have done, given half a chance. and so it's meant to be depoliticized, but I don't accept its Plan B. I think it is an extension of Plan A, and it is a coming together of a lot of experience which has been practiced by both governments over quite a long time, but focusing it and driving it further.
Now, Andrew, you were unusual as a minister even before you were a minister, in travelling around the country. You probably know, both when you were doing academies, then as you were President of Transport, and now on industrial policy. What have you learned in your most recent apparition as Secretary of Industrial Policy of your travels around Britain? What's the one lesson you'd recommend to Michael?
I don't think he needs any advice. I mean, actually, I think Michael's own experience was important to me too. I think in many ways his finest hour was Merseyside in the early 1980s, and having a minister who gets really stuck into the problems of a particular region and seeks to sort them out in the same way as they would sort out some kind of national problem and crisis in London. In the context of the 1980s, indeed historically in this country, it's very, very unusual. It's, one of the reflections I have from it is I think it would be a good idea if a certain proportion of ministers at any given time were actually based outside London, so that the whole experience wasn't in London and they actually did see the country from different vantage points. That's very unusual, and that was a bit of a model for me, actually, how little time. And it's important to understand, because it's also important to understand when there's business ministers, most ministers are part-time. They leave London lunchtime now on Thursday. They don't come back till Monday morning. They're in their constituencies for that time. And most of their experience of this country is their office in London, the House of Commons, or the House of Lords, but the House of Commons is an MP, and their constituency. And they have very little to do, apart from sort of fleeting visits in and out, making speeches written for them by civil servants, with the rest of the country. Talking about Germany, this is radically different from Germany, where you've got a federal culture, where you draw your ministers and your officials from, who are deeply rooted in different parts of the country. Most of our ministers are deeply rooted in London. Some of them do indeed have roots in their constituencies, which is why they become MPs and so on. But very few have much experience or knowledge, most of the rest of the country. And the seminal experience for me in this respect is since the party conferences have started going to the great regional capitals of the country, which is a huge, I mean, instead of going to Blackpool and Bournemouth, we now go to Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester, which is a great thing. I'm struck when I go there how many of my colleagues, this is parliamentary colleagues, leave aside the delegates, who say to me it is the first time they have been to Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham, as if somehow this is a great triumph of parliamentary democracy, that we now have party conferences that are in the cities, which enable them to go to these places. And I think in showing that the elites, the class that runs the country, which, unless they went to university in these places, and they'd only been to university in one of them, does not know the country outside the southeast, in showing that they do get to learn something about it, is very important. And the fact that sticks in my mind, reflecting again on Michael's report and the work I'm doing in the northeast, in 1912, the north of England, being the three regions of the northeast, the northwest, and Yorks and Humber, were 35% of the population of Britain. Now, in 2012, it's 25%. There's been this massive sucking of power, resource, population, all that into the south and southeast of England, and seeing that people actually, one of the prime requirements of a well-functioning democracy and economy is that the people who run it should have some knowledge of the country in which they live. And that's very weak in our system. Just end with a final thing. In the northeast of England has one FTSE company, one FTSE 100 company, which is headquartered in the northeast. It's Sage, the big computer company that grew out of Newcastle University. Its new chief executive has located himself to Paris. Now, this is the scale of the challenge that we face as a country, and it vindicates everything that's said in that report.
I mean, this is a tiny little microcosm of a story, but it's, I will tell it to you. Naturally, I have tried to keep abreast of what people are saying about this report, because I hope it'll get some traction. And if you were to say to me, what was the most disappointing point in all the comments, it was this. The report recommends that ministers should assume a titular responsibility for 2 of the local enterprise partnerships, and so should their permanent secretaries, and that they should visit them once every 2 months, simply to spend a day immersed in the problems of the LEP, and they would be different LEPs and all that. That's all, simply so they were involved in it. It meets all the point that Andrew was making. And I saw this described in one of the comments somewhere by a senior member of the coalition along these lines. It's a ridiculous suggestion, The idea that we have got no idea about place is just unrealistic. We have constituencies, for example. We know all about place. And then I thought about the constituencies that some of them represent. And the press never picked it, the journalist was content to just let it go without making the point. And I can't prove this because I have no idea who it was, but it sounded to me like someone who wasn't perhaps completely immersed in the problems of inner Liverpool or inner Manchester or whatever it may be. But it was left to go as though that was the answer. It was a bad idea because we know all about place. You know, when I was a member of Parliament for Henley, I used to come back from Liverpool and drive round my constituency and say, where is any comparison? And I would go, I remember vividly going to a place called Berrinsfield, which was, in quotes, the Sink estate. It isn't, well, in quotes, it was where everyone thought was the Sink estate of the Henley constituency. And it was smart, it was clean, it was litter-free, it had green, you know, and it was a council estate of significant quality. So my idea of place, the Henley constituency, was not Toxteth, to put it mildly.
Michael, on that note, thank you and thank Andrew for what has been absolutely fascinating hour and a half. I trust that over the park, George Osborne has had his spies or has heard what we've been saying, so that when we put the TV on or watch the debate, watch the statement at lunchtime in 9 days' time, more than a few of your recommendations will be referred to on that. So, Michael, thank you very much indeed. Andrew, delighted to see you back here discussing this subject. Could you all join me thanking them both?